Welcome to the Made in Migration podcast, brought to you by Lawgration, the specialist law firm that helps navigate the complex world of Australian immigration and citizenship law. Here we'll talk about all things to do with migrating to Australia. We're going to learn, grow and be inspired together. Make sure you subscribe and let us be partners on your journey. You're listening to a Lawgration production. This podcast is intended for education and/or entertainment purposes only. All content is current at the time of recording and subject to change without prior notice. While Lawgration is an incorporated legal practice, we are not aware of your personal circumstances, needs or goals, and information contained in this podcast should not be construed as legal, immigration or other advice. Before acting on any information in this podcast, you should always query whether it is relevant to your circumstances and consult an Australian immigration lawyer or registered migration agent. Welcome to another episode of the Made in Migration podcast. Today, we have the pleasure of hosting two distinguished guests from E61 Institute, Silvia Griselda and Harshit Shah. They are the minds behind the recent Understanding Visa Hopping Impacts on Australia's Skilled Immigration Landscape research note, which delves into the phenomenon of visa hopping among international students in Australia. Join us as we explore their key findings, discuss the implications of their research, and uncover the policy recommendations they propose to address this growing trend. Stay tuned for an engaging and informative conversation. Welcome, Sylvia and Harshit. Now, could you briefly introduce yourselves for our audience and explain your roles in the creation of this research note, please?
I'm Silvia Griselda, and I am the research manager for the Human Capital Unit at E61. So E61 is a non-profit, non-partisan economic research institute. And what we do here is we try to produce high-quality research that work on the Australian most important economic issue to empower the policy debate. So we deliver project through philanthropic funding and funded partnership. And one of our program is trying to understand the migration system in Australia and what are the solution to have a better migration system in Australia.
Fantastic. And Harshit, yourself?
I'm Harshit. I'm a economist at E61 Institute, and I'm also a PhD student at Australian National University. So I've been working with some topics of migration since the last 1 year, and at my PhD thesis, I've been working with some of the development topics related to India. And yeah, I'm a migrant myself. I came to Australia in 2018 from India. I did my master's, and now, hoping to finish my PhD soon.
That personal sort of exposure to the migration system would no doubt give you a unique perspective on these topics. What motivated you to research and write about the phenomenon of visa hopping?
It's a very interesting topic in the sense that there are two different sides of the story when we talk about visa hopping. Firstly, there are genuine concerns that migrants might be exploiting the loopholes to extend their stay in Australia, and visa processes and all the visa options which tend to kind of elongate your stay in Australia. It weakens the migration system if those options are not in a way genuine. So that was one concern, that this exploitation of the loopholes might might undermine the integrity of the migration system. On the other hand, you have someone like me. So I came to Australia in 2018. I did my master's. After doing my master's, I was part of the Australian labor force. I was trying to see if the Australian labor market is the best fit for myself, trying to pay off some student loan. And I was fortunate enough that I was able to land a provisional permanent residency. But if I would have started my PhD, say 2 months later, I would want to apply for a student visa. So there are some genuine migrants as well who, after their temporary graduate visa, would want to apply for another student visa to further study. So there are those two sides of the story, where one is that there might be a weakened migration system, but on the other hand, there might be some genuine students who would want to study more, build up their human capital, and ultimately have success in the Australian labor market. So we don't want to lose out on those migrants. So we wanted to check that what would be which side of the story weighs more, And that was one of the key motivations behind why we went towards this topic. And yeah, pretty much that.
So appreciation of that genuine tension that exists there. If we were to take a step back then and just talk about what is visa hopping.
For us and for our research, our definition is quite simple. So anyone who is on a temporary graduate visa, so temporary graduate visa is subclass 485 visa in Australia. So if you finish your master's degree or even your any vet courses, you get some time to stay in Australia and be a part of the Australian labor force. And that visa is known as subclass 485. So anyone within 5 years of getting their 485 visa, if anyone would get additional student visa, we term that migrant as visa hopper. So if I was on a 485 visa, after my 485 visa expired, the best case scenario for a migrant would be to go and apply for a permanent residency. And if they think that they are not a good fit for the Australian labor market, they might go back home and explore opportunities back in their home country. But some students would go for additional studies. And those students who, after the expiration of their 485 visa, apply for further student visas, we term those migrants as visa hoppers.
So it's got a very specific definition in respect of this research note. What are the most significant findings from your report regarding the trends in visa hopping amongst international students?
Visa hoppers, while back in 2009, they were not a large chunk of the migrants. About in 2009, 2.5% of the graduate visa holders tend to visa hop. But in recent years, there has been an increasing trend. In 2018, over 25% of the graduate visa holders were classified as visa hoppers in our study.
And why do you think there's been such an increase from 2.5% to 25% in the space of sort of just under a decade?
We believe that one of the reasons why there has been such a marked increase in visa hopping could be just related to what the migrant wants. There's some of the migrants, they want to come to Australia because of the fantastic studies which they get, the study opportunities they get in Australia. And after that, they might want to continue living and working here by transitioning from a temporary visa to a permanent residency. But not all migrants are fortunate and they do not succeed in that. So the practice of visa hopping is often done in the hope of increasing one's chance of getting a permanent residencies, because most of the visas which international students apply for, they are points tested visa. So a points based framework prioritizes the time spent in the country alongside other factors such as skills and age, among others. So this means that a temporary graduate visa holders can accumulate more points while they are in Australia for a longer period of time. So one way of getting kind of an edge over other students is getting additional staying in Australia for a longer period of time, accumulate more points, and beyond that, be in a position where you can get a points tested visa, which grants you permanent residency.
So, in a way, you're saying that it was the system may have incentivized that phenomenon through rewarding the points, etc.
Yeah, I mean the point system in itself, there are pros and cons. There will be some loopholes. There would be some other things which is better at capturing that. So we don't want to specifically comment on the point system per se, but just a visa system as a whole. If we believe that if it intentionally or unintentionally, it leads to it incentivizes you to elongate your stay in Australia without any genuine reason, then it's kind of it leads to a weakened migration system.
Also, one thing that we need to consider is that one of the reasons why the number of visa hoppers has increased is that the migration system in Australia has become tighter. And what I mean by that is that while the number of graduate visa has increased, so now Australia give more migrants or international students the opportunity to stay in Australia, the number of spots available for permanent residency has decreased. So on one side, there are more people that after the study want to stay in Australia, but the number of spots available for permanent migration has decreased. And I think this is going back a little bit on why we decided to study this topic, and it was partially due to our curiosity, and as Ashit said, really try to understand what is the trade-off between, there are some loopholes that migrants may want to exploit, but there could be some genuine migrants, and understanding the trade-off between these two, which one are the most likely to be the case, I think is important. But in general, I think our research try to shed some light on the migration system and why the migration system is becoming tighter, and what are the potential loopholes or the potential solution or eventually cause and consequence of this migration system that is changing.
That's super interesting. And other experts have also alluded to essentially a future problem that might face the system, in the sense that we do have a large number of international students who are already here, huge numbers post COVID in particular. And at the end of the day, not all of these students, or not all of those who are aspiring perhaps to be permanent residents in Australia, might be fortunate enough to receive PR. So what may happen to those people is a question that policymakers may have to grapple with. If we're to delve a little bit further now into perhaps the characteristics of some of these so-called visa hoppers, what does your research show in terms of whether they're low skilled or typically higher skilled? Do we have any information about perhaps countries of origin, etc.?
The main finding in that sense of our study was that banning visa hopping or curbing the practice of visa hopping was an effective strategy to control migration. This is because visa hoppers, we found, are low earning migrants during their time as graduate visa holders. So we studied their wages 1 year after, one financial year after, or the next financial year when they got their graduate visa. The visa hoppers tend to earn 20% less than other graduate visa holders on average. Even if we are comparing within the same occupation, they tend to earn 10% less than other graduate visa holders. And also their salary is similar to graduate visa holders who return to their home country. Also, we do not know anything about the skill of the migrants per se, but we can also say that in terms of the occupation where they are working, the migrants work in relatively lower skilled occupation compared to other graduate visa holders. One thing which was also very important in this study was, and which we found, was that visa hoppers who got permanent residency within the 5 years, their salaries were similar to visa hoppers who did not get permanent residency within the 5 years. So there is no particular distinction between a visa hopper who got an opportunity to stay in Australia versus those who did not get an opportunity to stay in Australia within the first 5 years of getting their temporary graduate visa.
Was that surprising to you, that particular finding specifically?
It is surprising in the sense we thought that there would be some distinction, but again, as you said, that there has been a debate around the points test system. Is that, are we picking up the right migrants? Are we picking up the highly skilled migrants? So this might be an opportunity for the policymakers to look into the migration system, to look into the points test system, and see that if are we picking up the right migrants or not. Because we also found that the migrants who got their permanent residency without visa hopping, they tend to earn a premium over, say, visa hoppers. They tend to earn a higher income. So on one side, we see that the current system is rewarding high skilled or high earning migrants. On the other side, there we are also picking up some of the migrants who are person not that high earning, or do not have high wages at the start of their career. So we have, maybe there is a need to look into the points test system and see that if we are on the.
And just for our audience, that's an ongoing conversation. The point system is being reviewed at the moment as well.
I think what Ashit said really summarized well what our research has done. And I think just to sum up, I think probably there are two reasons why we think that banning the visa hopping was the right strategy for the government. The first one is, as Harshit has said, is that the people that went back are not different than the people that stay, and the people that stay and were able to get permanent residence were not better than the people who stay without getting a permanent residence. So really, visa hopping is not an effective instrument to select the immigrants that have better labor market conditions.
One more thing which came out of this study was we wanted to analyze if a visa hopper came from a specific country. Why we wanted to look into this, because the decision of migrants to stay in Australia for as long as possible or to return to their home country depends on various factors. And one important factor in that is the opportunities available in their home countries. What we saw that migrants from South Asian countries, especially Nepal, Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, and Sri Lanka, they were more likely to engage in visa hopping, followed by those from Vietnam and Indonesia. And in contrast, migrants from other countries such as Malaysia, Philippines, China, and South Korea, they are nearly not like as likely to be involved in visa hopping as we compare to from a set of other migrants which we just categorized as those from countries which are not specified in this note. So their probability of visa hopping was very less, while those from South Asian countries, their probability of visa hopping was much higher. And this whole thing underscores the importance of labor market outcomes in origin countries in influencing visa hopping decisions. This was because migrants from countries with the weakest per capita earnings in our categorization, such as Nepal and Pakistan, migrants from those countries were more likely to engage in visa hopping.
Is that a relative figure? So does that take into account the significant number of international students, for example, from, say, the subcontinent region? Or is that all things being equal, the situation that you observed?
We just had a comparison with groups of migrant. So a migrant from a group, say from India, migrant from China, and we compared all of those things to a group of migrants which we categorize as migrants from other countries. So other countries is where we did not take the top countries from where the migrants are coming at, and you compared the probability of visa hoppings between both those groups.
There's many findings in your report, some of which we've just discussed, but based on your report, what policy changes did you recommend to address the issue related to visa hopping?
One of the things that we are a little bit careful is providing policy advice or a policy solution. And I think this is because this is not our role at E61 Institute. We think that our role is informing the policy debate by providing evidence based on data. One thing that probably comes up is that probably banning visa hopping was the right thing. As I said, it was very ineffective tool that migrants could exploit to stay in Australia. Another aspect is that banning visa hopping was the right choice. Probably other solution may be less effective. So I think one of the probably policy implication of our report is try to understand what are the mechanisms that try to select the best immigrants and which one do not, and try to exploit the one that are less effective in getting the immigrants that the government or the Australian as a country would like to stay.
Did you have a comparative perspective when you were doing the research? So did you look at different jurisdictions, similar jurisdictions, and what they were doing?
No, not really, because the data we are using are administrative data in Australia, so we focus on that rather than looking at other countries or institutions.
And on the data point, where did you source your data from?
At E61, we use widely the administrative data provided by the Australian Bureau of Statistics. What we mean by administrative data is that these data are collected not for the purpose of research, but rather for other purpose. So, for example, when international students apply for the visa, the government collect all this information. So we have data from all the migrants that apply and obtain a visa in Australia, and we are able to link those data with taxation system. So we are able to understand the kind of earnings they earn, the kind of salary they earn, and which kind of occupation or which kind of firms they work at. So this give us, first of all, the entire population of interest, because we have all people that apply for a visa in Australia, but also give us a rich set of information on their salary and kind of firms they work at. And these information are obviously true. They are not survey-based information.
And how does visa hopping impact the Australian skilled immigration landscape and the broader, I guess, economy?
One of the thing to mention is that definitely visa hopping is becoming a problem that it's getting bigger and bigger. While it was relatively lower percentage of graduate visa holder that was engaging in visa hopper, now it's around 30% of graduate visa that are engaging in visa hopper. One of the things is that these people, by staying longer in Australia, they are preventing other skilled migrants to remain in Australia. What I mean by that is that as Harshit was mentioning, the migration system is a point-based system. And if you stay longer in Australia, you obtain obviously more points. So by letting people that have relatively lower wage or they are less qualified to stay in Australia, by granting them additional student visa, these prevent other migrants that could benefit more from staying in Australia and could have a greater impact on the labor market to stay themselves in Australia.
Sylvia is absolutely right. I guess what we are trying to point to is that if we allow visa hopping, we might be artificially inflating the point system. And we don't want that. We want that there'll be the best suited migrants and who has the highest probability of succeeding in Australia in the longest period of time, they get a chance to stay in Australia. So we don't want we as a migration system would want to pick on those individuals. And one part of that is that we don't want the artificial inflation of this point system.
Sure. I think the phrase that's often used is the best and brightest. From what I gather, there's an opportunity cost associated with not curbing this particular practice that you've defined as visa hopping. Another thing that strikes me when you're talking is the 2009 to 2018 period is also coincidentally the period where we saw an exponential growth in the international education sector as well. I wonder if there's any correlation between this practice of visa hopping and the actual growth of that industry.
Yeah. I mean, some of the general views I would have, we have not explored as such any changes or visa policy changes and connected that to the visa hopping in our note. But in general, we had the night review in 2011, I guess. And with that, there were changes which resulted in an explosion of international students in Australia. And everything comes out to what Sylvia said previously, was that we have these higher number of students or higher number of people who are on a temporary graduate visa. And all these people would essentially, we believe, that would like to stay in Australia for a longer period of time and obtain a permanent residency. So while we are inviting more students and we are giving them the graduate visa, which is not related to you having any particular skill, it is just that if you have studied in Australia and you have done some basic requirements are met, you get this graduate visa. So you have an explosion of people who are on a temporary visa, but the permanent visa spots are not that much. And that's why this imbalance brings in an incentive to visa hop. So there could be many factors why migrants are choosing to visa hop, and one could be that because of I would say it's not an unlimited supply, but still it's like an unbounded supply of graduate visa holders, temporary graduate visa holders. They would want to stay in Australia, and because they did not get a chance, or that the migration system in itself is getting tougher and tougher, so they might have the only option which was available at their disposal might have been to visa hop.
And one thing that we want to add on the result funding is that while the practice of visa hopping is probably not as effective, over time we do see that people that are engaging in visa hopping have a similar wage than the people that obtain permanent residence over time. So it was very different, but now they are becoming similar and similar. And these give us suggestion that the migration system is indeed become tighter and tighter. And there could be some migrants that have high labor market opportunity in Australia, but because of the tightening migration system are now forced to visa hop.
At the human level of this, imagine you're the international student. Despite all the cautions and the management of expectations that would exist in that space, I think certain students might still nonetheless have certain expectations as to permanent residency or potential permanent residency. I've heard of certainly situations where people tend to think of the goalposts moving after the start of the match, and it sort of feeds into that person's overall, I guess, experience, whether it's the migrant experience or the education experience in Australia as well. It seems to me as though the public discourse would benefit from a more sort of open, honest conversation about realistic prospects. But I guess that's a bit of a different conversation to specifically the findings of your report.
You're absolutely right in that one. I guess it's more of also managing the expectations of the cohort which comes to Australia, is what experience they'll get and what are the future opportunities, what are the restrictions, what are the benefits and costs. Everything comes with the trade-off, and I guess the migration system would benefit.
It goes to Australia's overall standing and international competitiveness as well. The perception of whether there's like stable, consistent, transparent, well known structure in place there. But as I said, that might be a slightly different conversation. Let's talk a little bit about the effectiveness of the 1 July changes. Again, your report suggests that restricting access to student visas after the expiration of the graduate visa could encourage low earning migrants to return home. How do you ensure that this policy change won't inadvertently discourage genuine students from pursuing further education in Australia? It goes to the tension that you were describing.
We can't really. One of the things that we show in our research is that probably the number of students that are applying for a further student's visa in Australia is actually a small, after a graduate visa, is actually a smaller proportion. So that's why we thought that if we compare cost and benefit, probably dismissing and curbing visa hopping was the right way. But what you said is very true. There is a trade-off between try to encourage students to stay in Australia by promising them an opportunity to stay in Australia permanently. And obviously, we know that the education system and the international students are very important for Australian economy. And on the other side, there are all these debates on population pressure, and the government want to decrease the number of permanent migrants in Australia. One thing I wanted to add on this is that we are currently looking at additional research, really try to understand what is the optimal amount of say that Australia should give to international students after they complete their study. So what is the potentially optimal graduate visa, so temporary visa, that we give international students to stay in Australia? And I think Ashit can speak a little bit more on that if you want, but here the trade-off is, on one side we want encourage more students to stay in Australia, and probably the best students to apply for studying in Australia. On the other side, we don't want to provide a longer temporary visa, because this can create a limbo where international migrants can just stay in Australia without further prospect of staying permanently.
We also compared visa hoppers who returned to a study level which was below the study level for which they got their their graduate visa. So say there was study 1 and the migrant got a graduate visa, and then there was study 2. Now study 2 could be at a higher level or it could be a lower level. And the motivation behind that was that there might be migrants who would want to be genuine students, would want to study more, and those genuine students would go for a higher level of study than a lower level of study. And while comparing these two types of visa hoppers, we did not find any major differences in their labor market outcomes. So visa hoppers who are going in for a lower level of study, or visa hoppers who are going on a same level of study or a higher level of study, they are all the same, which we found out. So it's kind of, obviously there might be an opportunity, there might be a scenario where someone like me years back would have to would not be able to apply for a student visa while I was doing my PhD. But looking at a whole aggregate view, we found that there are not much differences in their labor market outcomes. Additionally, second thing which I want to say is that also the policy is such that you cannot make when we say that we are curbing the practice of visa hopping, it would mean that you cannot make an onshore application of a second student visa. So a student might go back to their home country and make another application of the student visa. So if they are, I believe that if a student like me, if I'm just talking about my case, so if I'm motivated enough, I would go back home, make another application, and would come back to Australia. So it might be kind of laying down a mechanism where you are able to still retain some of the motivated migrants who go back to their home country and then are able to convince the department that they are the genuine students by fulfilling all the criteria you have to meet while you're applying for the student visa, and then they come back to Australia. So that's still a possibility. That's not out of the picture. So that kind of a safety net which is already being in place with these changes. And with the next thing which Sylvia was alluding to was we are, we have other different projects going on as well. And one of those things was to see that what does higher or a longer stay period on a temporary visa, how does that affect your labor market outcomes? We are trying to study that. There was a change, as we talked about the night review, and the night review increased the stay period on a 485 visa, which is the graduate visa. How does that extra stay help you? Does that improve your labor market outcomes? Does it improve your uh, probability of being on a student visa or getting a permanent residency 5 years down the line?
I'd be very interested to know once it, of course, becomes available. But that's a super interesting topic because, of course, it's been tinkered with again recently.
Yeah,
The duration.
you're right. Like it's been at the focus of the policymakers, migrants, everyone would want, they were trying to change the stay period. So we are trying to see that the 2011 change, how did that affect the migrants?
Could the policy changes that you're talking about in your report, could they lead to unintended consequences such as a shortage of workers in certain industries that rely on low skilled labor?
That's certainly a short term cost to it, is that we might lose on to some of the people who were working as in a if we say that the visa hoppers were working already in a low skilled occupation, so we might lose on to some of those migrants, and there's a there's a shortage of supply of those migrants in those particular occupations, in those for those particular firms. But we believe that we still have to see. I'm not too sure about the quantity and the quantity effect of that, how much that would
Sure.
translate into kind of difficulties for these kind of firms or for these kind of industries. We still have to think about it. But in terms
Mm.
of having a genuine a genuine migration system, a more strengthened migration system, so there are some trade-offs, and we just wanted to shed light on those
Mm.
trade-offs.
I think also another thing to consider is that if Australia is concerned about some lower qualification job and occupation, probably there are better way to attract those kind of the people that are needed in those places rather than exploiting the students visa and education system in this way. So I think that's the main aspect of our note. We are not concerning on whether less qualified or lower wage individuals should stay in Australia. Is more probably some of these people were exploiting the education system and that was not effective.
Picking up on that word exploit, I think, I'm not sure, did your research look into any correlation between migrant worker exploitation or international students in the labor market and lower skills? Did you take that angle at all? Because some experts have argued that there is a correlation between being lower skilled and then being exploited in the labour market?
No, we didn't. And I think it's a very important topic. The only reason why we didn't do it is that it's hard with the kind of data that we have. As I mentioned, these are administrative data collected by the government. It's hard to have any measure of discrimination or exploitation in the labor market where potentially survey measure could be, or like interviews to immigrants or case study could be more interesting in that sense. But I think it's a great point.
Is there anything else that's on the cards? What are you working on?
I guess that's the major one which we have been working on, is to see that the night review changes, which increased the stay of 485 graduate visa holders. It increased from 18 months to 2 years, and then we are trying to see that people who got that extra say, how are their labor market compared to those who did not get that extra say. So hopefully we'll get that out soon, and that's one thing which has been going on. The institute itself has previously worked with the migration system as well, where they're trying to see the matching of migrants to the kind of the productivity level of the industries and firms they work at. So that one work has already been done by the institute, and yeah, in future we'll work more on migration for sure. Uh, and there has been I'm also working on one of the topics related to migration for my PhD thesis, but it's still in the early stages. So
We'll watch this space. How can our audience stay informed about your ongoing research and future publications?
I think they can just go to the website of the E61 Institute, and we publish both research notes, so finding based on our research, but we also have a newsletter, Plus 61, that they can subscribe to. If they go to our website, they can find the link to subscribe, where we really try to talk more and engage more with the policy debate to what are the important question or problem in Australia.
Well, I thank you both very much for your time. This has been a wonderful and thought-provoking conversation, and best of luck with your future research endeavours.
Thank you, Sidar.
thank you so much.
You've been listening to a Lawgration production. This podcast is intended for education and/or entertainment purposes only. All content is current at the time of recording and subject to change without prior notice. While Lawgration is an incorporated legal practice, we are not aware of your personal circumstances, needs, or goals, and information contained in this podcast should not be construed as legal, immigration, or other advice. Before acting on any information in this podcast, you should always query whether it is relevant to your circumstances and consult an Australian immigration lawyer or registered migration agent.